Washington is a movement master, author, and recovery advocate who is passionate about helping others navigate toward a happier and healthier life. And he has had a successful career as a contemporary dancer. He's worked for the New York City Opera, Metropolitan Opera, Broadway, in Disney's Lion King, and also struggled with addiction. And one of the keys to his recovery was through his study of Chinese medicine, discovering Qigong and healing touch. Those things were really not only key to his recovery, but key to what has become his life's work. Stephen is also the husband of one of our faves on the Language of Love, Lee Harris. I interviewed him not too long ago about his newest book, The Conversation with the Z's. Lee is a channel and a psychic and an intuitive. So the two of them are quite a powerhouse. In this episode, we're diving into Stephen's work and some of the amazing lessons he's learned that he's sharing with us about how to move through tough times, whether you're struggling with addiction, recovery, or just someone who's living in the world right now. We all need more support. So how to move through, change your life, how to end feelings of isolation, how to work with your triggers, how to process shame, how to use movement as a path to healing. I also get into it with Stephen about what it's like to be married to a channel. I've always been curious, so I'm asking all the good questions on this episode of The Language of Love. Welcome, Stephen Washington. I am so glad that you're able to join us on The Language of Love. I wanted to get into with you your book, which is really wonderful, is called Recovering You, Soul Care and Mindful Movement for Overcoming Addiction. And it's sort of, while there was a tremendous amount of movement strategies, and we're going to get into some of your specific strategies in a little bit, it was also kind of, in my mind, as someone who is not a recovering addict, but certainly loves a lot of recovering addicts and active addicts. I'm a recovering codependent, so I guess that's an addiction too. But to me, it's really a guidebook for kind of coming home to yourself and learning how to be with yourself in a way that, I loved how you were describing what's really an addiction. Like it's really, and I think you were talking about your story, which I want to ask you about, but how for you addiction was an attempt to kind of calibrate your body's energy and your emotions, either by numbing yourself out with substances or taking your energy up with substances, right? But that because you couldn't internally calibrate, like many of us, I love the way you put that, because to me, that is the core. Like I've always said that addiction, what you're doing with addiction is you're either running towards something or running away from something, but you're running, you're right. You're not being with yourself. And this was a really beautiful way to explain it, like inability to kind of calibrate. So to me, that's, whether you're consider yourself an addict or not, that was one of the most beautiful parts of this book to me. And I guess what you teach in general is that it was, and we'll talk about some of the different aspects that really stood out to me, but I'm wondering if you can comment a little bit on that.
Great way to begin this lovely conversation. For me, my using alcohol and drugs and cigarettes and at certain points food was definitely an attempt to self-regulate.
Yeah.
I did not know that that's what I was doing, but I was trying to bring about some level of peace, some level of balance, some sense of harmony within me, because I was anything but that. And it's only now in hindsight that I can see that that's what I was doing. And now I have healthier ways in which to do that. And I think that that's something that we're all trying to do in our own way, shape, or form, and to varying degrees of success. Or failure.
Or failure.
Yeah. But we're all just trying to be okay within ourselves and try to find some way to navigate life, because life is tricky. Life is challenging. Life can be scary. Life can be joyous. It can be heartbreaking. There's so many things, and we all need ways to help ourselves. Self-care. Ultimately, I think what's at the core of the book is self-care, and we all need to practice self-care, and most of us don't do enough of it. And I wanted to provide tools and practices to help people to help themselves. There's so many things within the book. I like to call the tools like tools that you put in a toolbox. But the thing about tools is they don't work unless you pick them up and use them and do them consistently. So this is definitely a collection of tools and processes to help us be more in harmony with ourselves and with the world around us.
Yeah, and during these times, it feels like more than ever. I mean, it really, I know every, 100 years or so, this happens in one form or another, but this is our lifetime's time, it feels like, where all hell is breaking loose on every level, from the macro to the micro within our own homes. I mean, just there, there's so much happening right now, and so much uncertainty, and so much upheaval, and so much division, and so much polarization, and so much anger, and so much anxiety. And, it just feels so, everything feels so heightened right now. And to me, these strategies are about learning to kind of internally reference your peace, your stability, your clarity, so that you don't have to numb out or externalize it. But I also want to highlight, and before we even dive into all of that, I just want to talk to you specifically about addiction, because in my mind, there are quote unquote hard addictions, let's call them. And what's hard, what's soft, but there's hard addictions and soft addictions. Like hard addictions would be gambling, sex, drugs, alcohol, maybe even love addiction. And soft addictions, social media, shopping,
Work.
work. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and I feel like we are all, myself included, like mine is, I mean, I am not only a recovering codependent, which, as I said earlier, is definitely a form of addiction, but also, I've learned to manage it, but I definitely, online shopping is one of the ways I numb out. The way I manage it is I still do it, but I put everything in my cart and I don't push buy. And then a few days later, I go back to the cart. And of course, I don't want anything that's in it still, or I don't need anything like I needed in that moment. Like, that's the way I've learned to not, spend all our money on addictive shopping to numb myself out. But I'm still doing it, right? At times, I notice now these days, even I, who I feel I've done a lot of work to learn to hold my center, even now during these times, have been, so I just was wondering if we can talk a little bit about that, because I know you're noticing that too. We will be getting in, because I have to talk to you about your husband as well, and about your relationship, because he's one of my favorite humans. And I know that he talks a lot about what's happening in the world right now.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering what your take on all of this is, and how that plays into what you're teaching.
Really good question. Here's what I think. I think that the world is crazy. The world has been crazy. It's always been crazy, except we know about all the crazy now because of
The
social
veil has
media,
been lifted.
because of social media, because of the news, 24-hour news cycle. It's everywhere. It's constant. And I think that the world has always been this balance of good and bad, peace and craziness. We just know about all the itty bitty bits of it.
Yeah.
And so it's a matter of how do we protect ourselves from all the information, all the stimuli, because it's overwhelming. It's
Mm-hmm.
overwhelming if there's no filter, if there are no barriers. So that's something that I could speak to for sure. And also, I think that there, like you talk about hard addictions, soft addictions, and I talk about this in the book. My story, your story, anyone's story, we're not going to be able to completely match one another's story is in terms of events
Mm-hmm.
and details,
Yeah.
but we can meet each other on the level of the heart
Yeah.
and the emotions, because what drugs and alcohol and cigarettes and food and all that did for me, and some of the harmful ramifications of those behaviors and dependencies, beneath all that was a sense of shame,
Yeah.
was grief, sadness, isolation, anger, frustration, all those things. And if we all look at what's underneath all of our dependencies, you'll find the same stuff.
Yep.
You'll find the
Same,
same
same
stuff.
little monsters, same little
Yeah.
gremlins. Yeah.
Yeah. And all of the practices that I've learned from being in recovery and everything else that I've done. Like you, I spent a lot of time working on myself in my life, and I'm 51. I've been sober for almost a little over 20 years, and I'm
Woohoo.
still working. I'm still working, and more things are being revealed, and more layers are being peeled back. So the recovery isn't a destination; it's a journey.
Amen. Yeah, it's never ending. I mean, that was something I had to really understand at a certain point too. And not only understand, but fully embrace that, if you're not healing, you're in the ground. Like
Yeah.
basically, it's until I'm sure we do it on the other side too. We keep healing. But
We'll see.
yeah, we'll have to see what happens.
Mhm.
But okay, so I want to unpack both of those things you said, because I did, I took some notes of some of the things you mentioned that I wanted to dive into, some of the topics of shame and isolation and some of the strategies you talk about. But let's talk about the first part, what your advice is, because it sound like you have some beneficial advice about how to manage, all of this crazy divisive input that we're being surrounded by, how to sort of protect yourself, as you said.
Self-care practices are really important. Keeping the focus more on yourself than on the world around you. And to hear myself say that, I know that there are going to be some people who will think, well, that's just selfish
Yeah.
if you do that. But here's the deal. You can't do anything for the world or anyone else in the world unless you take care of yourself first. It's
Yeah.
just you have no use to anyone if you're out there running yourself ragged on fumes, trying to help people or help others when you don't have anything to give to yourself. So it's really important to do that. Also, it's really important to be clear about your boundaries when it comes to people that you surround yourself with. I think there needs to be a level of reciprocity in our relationships, and sometimes relationships can be more heavy on one side or the other. And can you find balance in those relationships? Because I feel like our relationships need to feed us in some respect as well, but also we need to be able to give of ourselves too for it to be balanced. I also think in my own experience, it's been important for me to just pay attention to what kind of information I allow into my energy
Amen.
field. I can't watch the news all the
Me either.
time.
I can't watch it at all. I have my husband report the highlights to me because I
Yeah,
can't even watch, not
yeah.
only because it's so traumatizing, but because I get furious no matter what network I watch, and I've watched them
Hmm.
all, about how freaking biased like how the same story they like twist and turn to their own agenda. And then I'm like, what are you doing? You're adding to the division. I get like all
Yeah.
upset. So I don't even watch it.
I like news or information that's delivered to me with a little bit of humor
Oh, that's a
attached
good
to
one.
it. Like I love the ladies on The View because
Yes.
they talk about hot topics and they talk about politics, and
Yeah.
I'm
Or the
interested
news
in.
on I used to say that I get my news from Saturday Night Live.
Hey, because within all the jokes, there's a little bit of
Yes.
humor.
Yes.
There's a little bit of reality. There's a little bit of truth. I take a little bit from that, and occasionally I'll watch a news segment here and there, or occasionally I'll read an article, but I don't let too much of that in,
Yeah.
because I've had to learn to just let go. And also, I have to be mindful of when in the day I do that. It's not good
Mm-hmm.
for me to do that late in the day as I'm
Because
trying
then
to
you go to
unwind.
sleep and start thinking about it all. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think also limiting, because it's not just watching the news. And this is kind of the irony, is that we're numbing out from the chaos using social media usually. But then
Hmm.
social media is full of divisive and feeding you. The algorithm is feeding you more of your own viewpoint.
Hmm.
And a lot of that is divisive. I mean, I always say, if you want to know what you're unconsciously manifesting in your life, look at the Explorer page on your social media, because the algorithm will give you things on the Explorer page that are consistent with where you've been putting your attention.
That's so
Um,
true. That's
yeah.
so true. I also think that, and this is going to go back to my 12-step recovery days, there's an acronym called HALT. Don't let, and it warns us all to not let ourselves get too hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. And I feel as though when we are too much of any one of those things, we are more likely to search outside of ourselves to fill some sort of hole, some sort of
Yeah.
space, and really making sure that you eat when you're hungry. If you're angry, you're lonely, talk to someone, connect to someone. If you're tired, take a nap. If we do all those little bits of self-care, that puts us in a very different position, a very different state of being, and we're all able to navigate all the challenges that we're talking about in life and living on this very dense plane if we practice self-care in that way.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And, some of the other practices or issues that you talk about, which I think are super, super important, is isolation, which you referred to, like the loneliness, or in general as a key kind of undercurrent to becoming just as being unconscious or being in pain. Even forget addiction, just struggling. I mean, the world, we're more connected than ever before, electronically or digitally, but I feel like we're more isolated than ever before as well. And I love the discussion. You spoke a lot not only about isolation and the risks of it and why it happens. Right, we isolate to avoid conflict or to hide our shame, or to just be able to feed our addiction without interference. Right, but that isolation is so damaging. So I wanted to ask you about that, and also really important, because I feel like what's more important, or as important as talking about isolation, is our strategies for building connections, building communities, because people are craving this, and they can, sure, join an online community, which is a place to start, but we really need human to human connection. We
Mhm.
really, really, we are designed for that. Our systems need in person connection. So talk about that to me.
Hmm. Well, I thought that isolation was a great place to start in the book, and talk about it, because I feel as though isolation is something that feeds addiction. I think isolation is something that feeds a lot of the mental challenges we have in the world, because we feel like we're alone. We feel like no one else will understand us. We feel as though we are living on our own island. And like you said, we are designed for community, for connection. Human beings are tribal,
Yeah.
and we all thrive on a sense of belonging, and that's really important. And there's so many studies that show that when we have social support, the benefits to it are just countless, just in the ways that it enhances our own physical health and well-being. It helps us to manage stress and the challenges of life. It helps us to manage that. And so when we have that kind of support, it's less taxing on the systems. And it's so beneficial to our mental health to have connection, to have people who are able to help us when we need help doing things, even daily tasks, or when we need financial help. If there's people there who could support us, because money is a very big trigger. Money is
Mm-hmm.
a very complicated subject, and many of us in the world, there's a big talk about the haves and the have-nots. There's a great
Mm-hmm.
divide between the two, and so being able to support one another in those ways is very important. Just feeling heard. It's important to feel heard and to be seen. So many people feel invisible,
Yeah.
like their needs don't matter. And so I think
And just
talking about
companionship, and being
Mhm.
and having people to play with and laugh with,
Touch.
and touch and connect with and feel, like physically, not just intellectually and visually like we do digitally, but to really be in the energy of people who we feel connected to and supported by and aligned with.
So
um
important.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, just think about this. We think about just in the development of a child, how important touch is between a caregiver and a child, how the caregiver helps the child to learn how to regulate themselves just by touch, or just certain visual cues,
Yeah.
the sound of a voice, all those things where we're dependent upon early on in life. That gives us a great foundation. It helps us to wire the brain in a certain way. And I think even as we grow older, we're still dependent upon those aspects of community and connection. But something happens along the way for many of us, is that we get disconnected from that. And one of the ways that we cope with getting disconnected from each other is through substances or other dependencies, ways to regulate ourselves, ways to check out,
Yeah.
to
To
distract
numb out
ourselves, to
from the
numb.
loneliness. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, what
Mm-hmm.
are your tips for creating or finding community? Because I know you share a lot of good ones in your book.
Yeah, well, I think the first place to start is the awareness that you need it and that you would benefit from it. There's a willingness to seek it out, to be open to it. For me, when I began my recovery journey, I found community in 12-step recovery.
Right.
And thank goodness, because being able to go to various rooms and hear people share their experience, strength, and hope, and for me to be able to identify with them and to know that I was not alone was really important. And it didn't even matter if I raised my hand to share, or sometimes I would
Right.
raise my hand to share just to say, I'm Stephen. I don't really know. I'm really nervous. I don't know what to say. I'm just acknowledging that I'm here. And
Yeah.
that is enough to start. I talk about in the book how there's so many ways that we can start to create more social support for ourselves. And part of it is just like leaving the house, going for a
Step
walk.
one.
What happens when you leave
Yeah.
the house and you go for a walk? Maybe you'll run into a stranger and you can have an exchange of hello to someone you don't know, or a hello to someone that you do know, and have a moment of connection on the street. That's just incredible. That's one way to start to build a community, to build some sort of social support, following your instincts and your intuitions about what it is that you are drawn to naturally, what it is that you like to do. That's a great way to begin to find ways in which to connect with other
Like a
people.
class or a club, like a Sierra
Yeah,
club or a knitting class or a dance
absolutely.
class or something else.
Yeah,
Yeah. I mean, I've made a lot of friends in yoga classes and breath work classes and the things that I'm into as well. So yeah, that's a
yeah.
great tip too. What else you got? What
And
else?
if you have an animal, if you have a dog, my God, there's nothing so more connective than having a dog and walking your dog and then
Yeah.
meeting other people with dogs, and then
And
next
going
thing
to
you
the
know,
dog park, it's a way to pick up potential partners and friends.
all of it, all of it. Spiritual centers, that's one way also that I found community as well. And I never imagined that would be the case for me. In my recovery, my 12-step recovery was my spiritual center.
Mhm.
But around the time when my father passed away, when I was maybe 8 years sober, and I started to go to spiritual centers and attend services. And that was miraculous for me. Just being able to put myself in the room with all that energy was
Yeah.
really important.
Yeah.
So those are really great places and things to do to begin to start to build social support. And also therapy has been a big part of my life. Having social support can also come in the form of counseling, working with a
Yeah.
counselor. If I talk about this in the first chapter, when it comes to loneliness and isolation, one way to not feel so lonely and isolated is through body work, working with a body worker, someone that you trust, and receiving touch and receiving that kind of connection. That's twofold. You have the breaking out of isolation through touch, but also touch being a way to connect to another human being
Yeah.
in a
And
loving,
by
nurturing
healing
way.
touch, you mean like massage or
Yeah.
even Reiki, although they don't really, they're more touching above you than touching you, but any kind of healing hands kind of
Hmm.
stuff is really, and we're not talking about going to a sex surrogate or something, or,
No.
we're talking about, we're talking about that kind, the body work of the
Yeah,
healing body work.
exactly.
Um, you alluded to this in terms of the spiritual centers. I think you were talking about, and you wrote a lot about this actually more toward the end of the book, but it's something that I personally am really really interested in. I know many of my peeps are as well. It's something that I've been working on in many years, for many years, having been raised in a pretty very secular home where God was something very abstract and rarely talked about except a few times a year. And then it was more like, I better ask forgiveness for all the mistakes I've made and sins I've committed because I was in trouble in the book of life or whatever it was. So I never, ever, ever, my parents were God to me.
Mm.
They were the source of my safety and center. And protection and worth. It wasn't until probably my mid to late 40s that I started a spiritual quest of seeking God, Spirit, Allah, Jesus. Everyone can pick their own title, but seeking that deeper connection that is two ways, right? That isn't some abstract concept. And that also having that faith, which to me is absolutely a muscle, but having that faith that that power is there, and that whatever that name for it is that you have, and that you are held by that and supported by that and connected, and that which is right is unfolding, and that it's like a two-way exchange. It's not you just praying to some abstract man on a cloud, but that there is this co-creation, not co-support, what your support, the spirit doesn't need your support, but you receive that support and love and connection. And to me, that has been such a journey, and what I'm still figuring out about how to build faith. So I'm wondering if you can share what you've learned about that.
So important. And it makes me think about how much my spiritual life has grown over the last 20 years and how it's just continuing to grow in ways that I just could not even imagine. I was just having a conversation earlier today about faith with someone, and they asked me, how do I talk to this power greater than myself? And it's like, I talk to it just like I'm talking to you.
Mm-hmm.
Like, those are the greatest moments that I have with my higher power, is when I relate to it like I'm relating to you, and being as authentically me as I can possibly be. And I use words, which I think is important because it's just important for me, so I can hear myself speak and hear what it is that's going on in my head and my heart. But my higher power knows before I even utter a word.
Right.
It's that deep, it's that meaningful, it's that personal. When I first began my spiritual journey of sobriety, I I already believed in a higher power, but I didn't think that my higher power believed in me. In some ways, I kind of felt like I was forgotten. I was still living with the higher power that I grew up with in Southern Baptist churches, and where I didn't feel like I belonged because I was gay. I didn't even before I knew what being gay was, I felt like I was different, and I knew that my difference wasn't something that was going to be embraced in the walls of that church.
Right. And that was all you knew of God.
That's
So
all I knew.
so it
That's
wouldn't be embraced by God either in your mind, which unfortunately you were the majority of kids.
Yeah, yeah. And it wasn't until I found recovery and I was shown that having a higher power or some relationship with a higher power was going to help me in my recovery, is going to help me stay sober for a long time, hopefully the rest of my life. That it's just important to have that kind of connection. Not that sobriety requires you to believe in a God. Lots of people are sober and they don't believe in a higher power. They don't believe in a God. But my definition of a higher power is all encompassing. It encompasses everything. It encompasses nature, love,
Yeah.
music, art. My higher power encompasses like the energy I get from animals in my life too. So I'm able to tap into all of that and appreciate all of that, and really work on being as open and receptive to what my higher power brings into my life, and that to trust that my higher power loves me unconditionally, loves me more than words can ever express, accepts me for exactly who I am. My higher power is funny as all hell.
How do you
Quite
know it says funny things, or just the things that happen are
just
so ironic that you can't help but crack up?
yeah, basically all the above, and it just
Yeah.
makes me crack up. So that's how I know it's real.
Yeah.
That's how I know it's real. And it's constantly changing and unfolding. And I love what I talked about in the book and what my friend Jennifer said for the people who maybe have a difficult time with the concept of God or a higher power, that it doesn't really matter if you don't believe in a higher power, because your higher power believes in you, and that there's a reason why you've made it as far as you have in your life, and survived all the challenges that you have, and the higher power, the energy of it is wrapped up in all of it, and that it's okay to trust the process. And I
Yeah.
feel as though my higher power is the embodiment of that.
That's beautiful. I was thinking as you were talking, because my faith journey, I would say, really began in earnest a few years before my father died, and he died 2 or 3 years ago. So it was maybe 5 or 6 years ago at this point, where I really, where the idea, I had started a spiritual journey way before that, but the idea of a two-way relationship with God, spirit, universe, what, non-denominational there, was just starting. I was just starting to wrap my head around it, and I had a lot of I think part of the reason I had a lot of resistance was not only because I'd never had a concept of that, but because I too was raised in, the Bible Belt as a Jewish girl from New York. My family moved down to Southeast Georgia when I was in middle school, and so the entire community was Baptist and very religious and very prejudiced against anyone who wasn't. And so I experienced so much rejection and shame and humiliation and bullying that, like, if I met someone who was a born again Christian, like, I was running the other direction, because to me that equaled nasty judge, which isn't fair. I'm just telling you about my ignorant perception as a kid and as even a young adult. It represented rejection and humiliation and ignorance to a certain degree of, in my opinion, of like only seeing one thing as correct. I mean, I had so many judgments. And then I met a beautiful soul down in Georgia. God bless him. His name is Gregory Goodwill. And he was isn't that a great name?
Yeah.
Gregory Goodwill. Shout out to Gregory Goodwill. And he was my father's nurse, caretaker, basically. He was the RN that was taking care of my dad in the last few years of his life. And Gregory always had a Bible in his hand. And he asked me one day, we were sitting in a waiting room in a hospital, and he asked me about the difference between what Jews believed and what Christians believed. And I said, well, basically the essential difference is that you believe that Jesus is the Son of God, and Jews believe that Jesus was Jewish, which Christians do too, but that he was an amazing sage, God connected healer of the utmost degree, but was not God's child. And any more than any of the rest of us are, or any less. And so that opened this whole realm of conversations. And I'll never forget him saying to me, and this is what really struck me, and I've never forgotten. He goes, God is my very, very, very best friend. I was like, what? What are you talking about? God is your best friend. And we had so many conversations, but it was really ironically through him, who was a born again, he was part of that community. Not that he didn't ever reject. I mean, he was not someone, he was someone who was the complete opposite of what I had always experienced growing up from people who believed what he believed or subscribed to what he believed. And he was really, I think, the catalyst for me starting to be like, okay, let me open my heart to this. I'm not a born again Christian. It's not about Christianity or choosing Jesus as my savior. It's not, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that he was the beginning of my path of, like, even conceiving of the idea that this could be a two-way relationship.
That's so beautiful.
So
I
shout
love
out to
that.
Gregory Goodwill.
Gregory Goodwill, thank you for walking into Laura's life. That's
Yeah.
incredible. I love that. I love that. It's a powerful time when you're in the process of witnessing someone transitioning, leaving this plane and
Yeah.
moving on to another. It's a very tender time.
Mm-hmm.
And like you, I just had just such a growth filled experience around that, and
Yeah.
just diving deeper into my own mortality and my own heart with it all.
Yeah.
And I grew so much because I started going to spiritual centers, but that shocked the living daylights out of me, because I never would have imagined that I would be a regular churchgoer. I just
Yeah,
did
because you
not
had been
envision.
felt so rejected by it in the same way I did.
But this
And
place was very different. It was
yes.
very different. It was so open. It was so inclusive. It was
Yes.
all about the music ministry, and the music was what really touched me, like, would bring me to tears.
Mm-hmm.
We are so going off topic from the book and everything like that, but that's fine because I have to share this with you. Uh, during that time, I remember going to service, and a friend of mine that did the Lion King with, his name is Charles Holt. Charles was a guest singer at the church that Sunday, and he sang a song called "Rolling River God." And when he sang this song, it touched my heart so deeply that I burst into tears. I'd never heard a piece of music like that before. I had to get the recording of the service so I could hear the song again. I listened to that song during the days when we had iPods. That's how long
Mm-hmm.
ago it
Mm-hmm.
was.
Mm-hmm.
And every time I would listen to that song, I would cry because I was just crying. I was crying so many tears for so many different reasons,
Yeah.
and it opened me up in a way that I just will never, ever, ever forget. And I feel like the whole process made me more human, made me more
Wow,
human.
that's beautiful. Yeah, music can do that. And I know you talk about that in the book as some of the pathways. And I think you even said that sometimes you didn't tell that story, which is a beautiful story, but that sometimes music is a pathway to God and to peace and to calming down from your trigger. And um
Mm-hmm.
I want to just, I know that you mentioned Lion King, you come from a background of dance, you're a dancer, you're also a healer, and you talk about one of your specialties. And I know you actually have a community online called the Stephen Washington Experience Studio, right? So it's like a subscription platform where people can get access to all of your movement classes and videos because you specialize in Qigong,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I know
Qigong
you
and Pilates.
and
Mm-hmm.
Pilates, and I know
Mm-hmm.
you share a lot of qigong. I mean, Lee, your husband, told me about your qigong practice several years ago when I first met him. And I think I took a few of your online classes because I've always wanted to do that. What I wanted to ask you is, because qigong is basically mindful movement, right? And it's kind of centering you and grounding you and getting you back into your body, which is where the true power and spiritual connection and healing is found. I'm always talking about that on this show. And to me, it's almost a form of somatic expression. But just what I don't understand, just because I'm clueless, what is the difference? But I don't know enough about it. What is the difference between qigong and tai chi?
Great question. It's a common question. My understanding is that Tai Chi is just another form of Qigong,
Oh.
and that the difference between the two, or one of the differences, is that Tai Chi is you will take several movements and string them together,
Mm-hmm.
almost like a dance.
Yes.
In Qigong, we take one movement and we repeat it over and over and
Oh.
over and over again. So that's one big distinction between the two. I believe it's still a practice to do for health and well-being, as well as energy cultivation and
Yeah, and is it the
circulation.
same thing? Because I did take a Tai Chi, several Tai Chi classes, and what I found, and I'm wondering if the same thing happens in Qigong, there were these movements where you were almost building energy between your hands
Mhm.
and like building it and then like putting it into your heart. And I literally was like, whoa. I mean, I could totally feel it because the movements were kind of feeding and building the energy. Does the same thing happen in Qigong?
Absolutely.
All right, I'm
Absolutely.
definitely gonna do this with you. I'm getting on that Stephen Washington experience.
Well, good. I encourage you to do that and everyone else, because right now I'm offering a free 14-day trial
Oh, you are?
for the platform. So anyone
Oh.
who's interested, just go to stephenwashingtonexperience.com and you can sign up and give it a shot for 2 weeks. We'd
All
love
right,
to
we're
have
going to
you.
put that in the show notes.
Great.
That the link to the Stephen Washington Experience, which is the website name too,
Mm-hmm.
we will put in the show notes. I can't end our conversation without talking a little bit about your husband, Lee Harris, in particular. Not talking about him per se, but talking about having. He's told me about you, but you and I have never actually met before now. Um, and I've always been curious, and I asked him. He's like, "Oh, you'll have to ask him." And this was years ago when he said that, with his little British accent. But Lee, as you guys know, he's been on the show before, is a spirit. I mean, you probably will have his correct title, but I would call him, a spiritual teacher, a psychic, and really a channel of this group of spiritual masters, spiritual entities that are called the Z's. And you can listen to the podcast, guys, that I've done with him to learn more about that. But the thing I want to talk about now is what it's like to be married to someone like that. Like when you guys first got together, were the were the Z's part of it? Like when did you first learn, did you know about what he was about before you met him in person? You know what I mean? Or was it something you discovered once you were already in relationship with him? What
Yeah,
happened?
it's something that I didn't know. I knew that we both valued spirituality and that it
Yeah.
was a central focus in our lives independently of one another. And I knew that when we got together, it was going to be something that could grow and develop and change. But I had no idea that he was a channeler. I had no idea that he was an intuitive. And it's funny that you asked this question because one of the things that we realized early on when we first started dating and seeing each other was that there was so much more than being significant others to one another. There's so much more to us, and we saw a potential for us to work together and collaborate. He walked into the Pilates studio I was teaching at in Palo Alto around the time that we met, and he saw me teach, and he was just blown away because he could see my level of mastery with that. And he had some events in Australia that he was scheduled to do, and he wanted to have a movement component to it. And so he invited me to go with him to Australia. We'd only known each other literally a month, 2 months,
Wow.
maybe before something like that happened. It was really magical, a really magical time. But I'll never forget during one of those events, those evening events that he did in Australia, I watched him channel for the first time.
And did you know before then, or did he just start channeling? I mean,
Um,
had he
I
said, by the way, just so you know?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think I think I knew, but I didn't really think much of
Yeah.
it, and I
Yeah.
didn't know too much about channeling, other
Yeah.
than the fact that I had a friend's mother in high school who was a channeler, and she did a couple of sessions for me and all that. So I wasn't opposed to it, or I wasn't afraid of it or anything like
Yeah.
that. I was, but I remember that night watching him do what he did, and it was just blown away. And bless him, I think he was so accustomed to some people not being able to accept him because of that part of himself that he on some level he had an expectation that once I saw that I might not
That
want
you
to
were
be
gonna
with him.
bail.
Yeah, yeah.
Aw,
And it
boo
was
boo
it was
Lee.
and it was anything but that. It
Yeah.
was anything but that.
Aw.
Yeah. And so things just grew and developed from there.
I would
Um
love, see, speaking of building faith, if my husband, who is the opposite of Lee, my nickname for him is Senor Root Chakra, like he is so in this 3D.
yeah.
But I mean, he's a wonderful man and I adore him, but he's Mr. Pragmatic. He would not, I mean, I think he's an empath, but he would never admit it.
Well, that's the yin
Um,
and the yang.
yes,
You're his
definitely.
yin.
Definitely. I'm all yin and
Yeah,
he
yeah,
is
yeah.
heavy yang.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I've thought like, God, if that were, if I were married to someone like that, like I would be asking a million, like, do you, like I would have, I mean, you're probably used to it now, but I would be asking, talk about building faith. I would be like checking in with the Z's, like, Lee, listen, where's the best place for us to live next? What should we
Yeah.
embark on this thing or not? Like how much of a role do the Z's have in the ones he channels, and it's such wisdom, guys. I mean, we all have access to that wisdom, but they have this great, the Z's and Lee just have this beautiful way of distilling it,
Yeah.
and articulating it. So how much do the Z's and the channeling play a role in your daily lives?
Well, the thing is, it's also integrated that
Yeah.
it's not so specifically like I'm talking to the Z's or I'm getting advice from the Z's. It's also well integrated
Yeah.
that it just flows effortlessly through.
Yeah.
So it's not something that is really perceptible
Yeah. Yeah.
from the surface, it's just integrated. It's all
It's
integrated.
integrated.
Hmm.
And I wonder, and I mean, I was thinking like they could have officiated. It would have been interesting if they officiated at your wedding. Wouldn't that be fun?
Oh, that might be a little weird. That might be a little scary.
Because it was Lee, right? Like he's the groom, one of the grooms, and he's also being like, I was laughing to myself this morning because I was thinking, oh, And it been felt like he would have jumped to the front of you and been like, okay, said and then jump to the side. Anyway, this is how I entertain myself with these stories in my mind. But yeah, and you talked a little bit in your book about how, and I think this is so important, and I really wanted to highlight this in this conversation with you and get a little bit more from you about it, is how important for your recovery, like the dynamics of living in relationship in recovery, because one of the things we talk about on this show all the time are the millions of different ways it comes up so often that our partner is our greatest teacher, obviously, but also because part of the reason they're our greatest teacher is because they're our greatest trigger.
Mhm.
And they're gonna, just by nature, a relationship is going to bring up so many growth edges, so many triggers, so many tough things that you
Mhm.
have to kind of face about yourself or work with within yourself or navigate or negotiate between the two of you. And that's why they say, while you're in recovery, I don't remember what the time frame is, but you're not supposed to be in a relationship while you're actively working your recovery or newly in recovery. You're supposed to be really solid in your recovery before you get into a relationship. And I'm sure this is one of the reasons, as well as heartbreak and trigger, other things that might trigger a relapse. But I'm wondering what you could add about some of the challenges, but even more specifically, some of the strategies that you've developed or discovered as you've moved through relationship in recovery, because this is a tricky thing for people who are in recovery.
It is. And that thing that you just mentioned is that suggestion to not get involved in any intimate or romantic relationships in the first year of sobriety. And in large part because it's just important to keep the focus on yourself and your own
Mm-hmm.
health and well-being. And also, you don't really know who you are. I mean, there's
Yeah.
who you are when you're in active addiction is drastically different from who you are in recovery, especially once you begin the healing process and doing the work. We do change. There's certain things about us that don't change, but there's
Yeah.
certain things that do change. And it's been a remarkable experience being married in recovery and being with my husband. I think I got very lucky to connect with someone who was willing to do the work that's involved in being in a partnership. And
An emotionally healthy partnership
yeah,
anyway.
yeah. I mean, the thing is, one of the things that's worked well for us is the fact that we communicate. We communicate pretty well. Communication, we say, is one of our superpowers, and that's so important. It's just communication. Another thing that comes to mind about my unique situation with Lee and our relationship was we come from very different backgrounds.
Yeah.
I think the fact that I'm African American and he's not, the fact that I'm American, he's British, those two things bring a lot to the table. But also, I come from I went through a lot of trauma early in my life, and that has created some interesting things to navigate and to heal from. And so it's so important to do the work individually and then together in order to work through that stuff, because it's not easy stuff to navigate, and none of us come with an instruction manual as to how to do it. And a lot of things get said that you wouldn't say again if you could take it back, and a lot of things get done that you wouldn't necessarily do if you could do it over again. Fertile ground for growth. And what I would advise anyone to do is to not do all that work by yourself. Like
And
I've
get
I've
support.
yeah, get support. Like I've had a therapist, through most of my life at, various times with different
Me
people.
too.
And I've just started working with another therapist again, but this time focusing on trauma and doing some somatic experiencing work.
Oh, yay. I love somatic
Yeah, and
experiencing.
neurofeedback. I've been doing a lot of neurofeedback, and
Mm-hmm.
those things have been helping me because I've just at 51, I understand that there's a certain way that I relate to the world because of my experiences, and I need to get more perspective on it. I need to get more tools so that I can have more freedom and more choice within that rather than just responding and reacting to the world and dissociating and things like that when I get triggered. So it's been such an amazing experience to do this work, and that's the thing. The longer we're alive, the longer we're in recovery, the more experiences we're going to have, the more opportunities to grow and change, the more challenges we're going to get, the more layers of the onion we're going to peel back, and sometimes it feels like you're ripping a band-aid off.
Yeah.
But the most important thing is to not give up, to not give up on yourself, to love yourself, to forgive yourself, and keep showing up. And yeah, and aren't we lucky, if you're, since we're talking about relationships, to have someone in your life who loves and cares about you enough to be there and be a witness to it all, and to do the work with you, and to do their own work too,
Yes.
to do
That
their
is
own
so
work as
important.
well, because
Apart and
because we
together.
all we all need work.
Yeah, we do.
Hmm.
And I think we can end on that beautiful one of the things. I mean, everything you said was beautiful, but one of the things that stood out to me that you said sort of toward the end of your book and that you alluded to just now is that we talk so much, especially when we're healing our past and learning to integrate that healing, not only to heal, but integrate that healing into our lives, that so much of that work is about forgiving those who have trespassed against us, right? Forgiving. But self forgiveness is something, forgiving yourself for the ways you've screwed up, for the mistakes you've made, for the places you've been blind or ignorant or self sabotaging or hurt other people or made mistakes or fell off the wagon or all of those things. That forgiving yourself was something that I think isn't talked about enough, and you really beautifully spoke to that in your book. So I just want to highlight that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's important. It's important,
Yeah,
and that forgiving yourself is so important. And sometimes it's one of the hardest things to do,
yeah,
but I think it's really important work, because we're all doing the best we can at any given time. We're all doing the best we can with what we have.
yeah.
I know we
We
hear it a
all have
lot,
the yeah.
but it's
We're all
true.
we're all just walking ourselves and each other home, as Ram Dass would say. So
Mm,
thank you for walking with us and for doing and dancing with us and doing all the beautiful work in the world that you're doing. And make sure to check out the Stephen Washington experience. We have the link in there. The book, once again, is called Recovering You: Soul Care and Mindful Movement for Overcoming Addiction. Lots of tools and tips and strategies and even specific Qigong moves for doing different things that will facilitate your soul and your recovery. So thank you. I'm going to come play with you and Lee soon.
I love that. Thank you.